I arrived at Wexford Hall on a morning so cold the breath of the horses hung in the air like ghosts. The carriage had traveled through miles of barren moorland, and I had watched the landscape grow wilder, more desolate, as though the very earth knew what kind of man ruled over it. The Duke of Wexford was not a name spoken lightly in drawing rooms or servants' quarters. He was a man carved from winter itself, they said, a widower who had loved once and vowed never to love again. His reputation preceded him like a shadow, whispered about in the corridors of great houses and the modest parlors of the gentry alike. They said he had dismissed servants for the smallest infractions, that he never smiled, that his heart had turned to ice the day his young wife was laid in the family crypt. They said his son, the heir to the dukedom, was as silent as a tomb, and that no governess could reach him. I was 24 years old, orphaned at 16, and I had spent the years since then teaching the daughters of minor gentry, moving from one household to another like a shadow. My father had been a clergyman with more books than income, and my mother had died bringing me into the world. When my father passed, I was left with nothing but an education far above my station, and no prospects whatsoever. I had no family, no fortune, no beauty that might have secured me a different fate. My hair was an unremarkable brown, my figure slight, my features plain. What I had was a sharp mind, a steady hand, and a heart that had learned to expect very little from the world. When the position of governess to the young son of the Duke of Wexford was offered to me through an agency in London, I accepted without hesitation. The salary was generous, far more than I had earned in any previous post, and the agent had been oddly insistent that I was particularly well suited for the role. I told myself it was simply another post, another child to educate, another roof under which to shelter. But even then, as I signed the contract with hands that trembled slightly, I think I knew it was something more. There was a desperation in the agent's eyes, a relief when I agreed that suggested others had refused. The house rose before me like a fortress, and I felt my breath catch despite myself. It was built of gray stone, darkened by centuries of rain and wind, with towers that pierced the low clouds and windows that reflected nothing but the bleakness of the sky. The architecture was severe, unforgiving, with none of the graceful embellishments one might find in London townhouses or country manors of gentler aspect. This was a house built to withstand, to dominate, to stand against time itself. The gardens, if they could be called that, were overgrown and tangled, as though no one had cared for them in years. Rose bushes had grown wild, their branches bare and twisted like arthritic fingers reaching toward the gray sky. The hedges were uneven, the paths covered in fallen leaves that no one had bothered to sweep. There was a fountain in the center of the courtyard, dry and cracked, its stone basin filled with dead leaves and rainwater turned black. A stone cherub stood at its center, one wing broken, its face worn smooth by weather until its features were barely visible. As the carriage pulled to a stop, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. The driver, a local man who had said barely 3 words during the entire journey, climbed down and retrieved my trunk without meeting my eyes. He set it on the ground with more force than necessary, then climbed back to his seat and departed before I could even thank him. The sound of the horses' hooves faded quickly, swallowed by the wind, and I was left standing alone before the great doors of Wexford Hall. I waited, my hands folded over my reticule, trying to appear calm though my heart raced. The wind cut through my traveling cloak, and I could smell rain approaching. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the great doors opened. The housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, met me at the threshold. She was a tall woman, perhaps 50, with a face like carved wood, worn and expressionless. Her dress was black, high-necked, without a single ornament, and her hair was pulled back so severely it seemed to pull at the skin of her temples. She did not smile. She did not welcome me. She simply looked me over with the kind of assessment one might give to a piece of furniture being delivered, her gray eyes taking in every detail of my appearance, finding me, I was certain, wanting in every respect. "Miss Ashford," she said. It was not a question, and her voice was as cold as the stones beneath my feet. "Yes," I replied. "I am expected." "You are late," she said. Though the clock in the hall behind her showed, I had arrived precisely at the hour specified in my instructions. She gestured for me to follow her inside, leaving my trunk where it lay. The interior of Wexford Hall was as cold as its exterior, perhaps colder, for here there was no wind to blame. The entrance hall was cavernous, with a floor of black and white marble that gleamed in the dim light, filtering through windows set too high to offer any real illumination. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch with disapproval, their eyes following me as I passed. Men in armor, women in ruffs and jewels, children who looked like small adults, all regarding the world with expressions of judgment and superiority. There were no flowers, no warmth, no sign that a child lived within these walls. Everything was silent, as though the house itself held its breath, waiting for something, though I could not have said what. Mrs. Brennan led me across the hall, our footsteps echoing, and up a staircase that spiraled into shadow. The banister was carved with intricate designs, vines and flowers and strange creatures, but the wood was so dark and the light so poor that the details were lost. We climbed 3 flights, then turned down a long corridor lined with closed doors. The carpet runner was worn in the center, the wallpaper faded and peeling in places. Whatever grandeur Wexford Hall might once have possessed, it had faded long ago, or perhaps had never existed at all outside the cold magnificence of its stone walls. Mrs. Brennan stopped at a door near the end of the corridor and opened it without ceremony. "This is where you will sleep," she said, stepping aside to let me enter. "The boy takes his lessons in the East Wing. Breakfast is at 7 in the servants' hall. The Duke does not tolerate lateness. You will attend him in his study at 8 this evening. Do not keep him waiting." I stepped inside, taking in the small room with a glance. A narrow bed with a thin coverlet, a washstand with a chipped basin, a small wardrobe, and a single window that overlooked the moor. The walls were bare except for a faded print of a biblical scene, and there was a fireplace, small and blackened with soot, but no fire had been laid and no coal sat in the scuttle beside it. I turned to ask about the fire, about my duties, about the child I was to teach, but Mrs. Brennan was already gone, the door closing softly behind her. I heard her footsteps retreat down the corridor, and then there was nothing but silence. I stood there for a moment, alone in that cold little room, and I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me. I had lived in many places, served many families, endured indifference and occasional cruelty, but I had never felt quite so unwelcome, quite so invisible, as though I were already a ghost haunting these halls. I unpacked my few belongings, hanging my 2 good dresses in the narrow wardrobe, setting my brushes and pins on the washstand, placing my small collection of books on the windowsill. They looked pathetic there, my few precious volumes, but they were all I had of my father, of my old life. I washed my face in the icy water from the pitcher, changed from my traveling dress into one more suitable for the evening, and sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin and hard, and the room smelled of damp and disuse. Through the window, I could see the moor stretching away into the distance, gray and brown beneath a darkening sky. No trees broke the monotony of the landscape, only endless rolling hills covered in dead grass and gorse. It was beautiful in its way, I supposed, if one admired desolation. As the afternoon wore on, I heard the house around me, the distant sound of footsteps, a door closing somewhere below, the creak of floorboards. But no one came to my room, no one called for me, and I began to wonder if I had been forgotten entirely. Finally, as the light began to fail, I heard the sound of a bell ringing somewhere deep in the house. I waited, uncertain, and after a few minutes there was a knock at my door. A young maid stood in the corridor, barely 16, with a thin face and frightened eyes. "Dinner is served, miss," she said, not quite meeting my gaze. "In the servants' hall. I am to show you the way." I followed her down the stairs and through a maze of corridors until we reached a long room beneath the main floors where the staff gathered. The servants' hall was warmer than the rest of the house, heated by the proximity to the kitchens, but it was hardly welcoming. There were perhaps a dozen people seated at a long wooden table, footmen and maids and kitchen workers, and they ate in near silence, their heads bent over their plates. The food was plain but adequate, bread and soup and cold meat, and I took my place at the far end of the table where a space had been left. No one spoke to me. No one even looked at me. It was as though I did not exist, as though I were merely another shadow in a house full of them. I ate quickly, the food tasteless in my mouth, and when the meal was finished, I returned to my room to wait for the summons I knew would come. At precisely 8 o'clock, there was a knock at my door. Mrs. Brennan stood in the corridor, her face as expressionless as before. "The Duke will see you now," she said. I followed her back through the house, upstairs and down corridors I had not yet seen, past more portraits and closed doors and rooms shrouded in darkness. We stopped finally outside a set of double doors carved with elaborate designs, and Mrs. Brennan knocked once, then opened them without waiting for a reply. The study was the first room in Wexford Hall that felt alive. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the room was lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them, their leather spines gleaming in the firelight. There were globes and maps, a telescope near the window, chairs upholstered in deep green velvet, and a massive desk near the fire, its surface covered with papers and ledgers. The air smelled of wood smoke and leather and ink, and for a moment I felt a pang of something like longing, for this was a room my father would have loved. Behind the desk sat the Duke. He did not rise when I entered. He did not acknowledge me at all at first. He was writing something, his head bent over the paper, his hand moving with quick, precise strokes, and I stood there in the doorway, waiting. Mrs. Brennan had already disappeared, closing the doors behind her with a soft click. I studied him as I waited. This man whose reputation had preceded him, this widower who ruled over Wexford Hall like a king over a barren kingdom. Finally, he set down his pen and looked up, and I felt the full weight of his gaze. I had heard that the Duke of Wexford was handsome. I had heard that he was cold. Both things were true, but neither quite prepared me for the reality of him. He was perhaps 35, tall even sitting down, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of slate, hard and measuring. His face was angular, aristocratic, with high cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved from granite. He was handsome in the way a winter landscape is handsome, beautiful, and utterly without warmth. He looked at me the way one might look at a ledger, assessing, calculating, finding me already insufficient. "You are Miss Ashford," he said. It was not a question. His voice was deep, cultured, and utterly devoid of inflection. "Yes, Your Grace," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving my face, and I forced myself not to look away, though every instinct told me to lower my eyes. "You come recommended by the agency," he said. "They assure me you are competent. I have taught for 8 years, Your Grace. I'm experienced in Latin, French, literature, history, and mathematics. I have references from 3 families of good standing." He waved a hand, as though references were meaningless, as though the opinions of others held no weight in his judgment. "My son is not like other children," he said, and for the first time I heard something in his voice, something that might have been pain or anger or both. "He does not speak." I felt shock run through me, though I tried to keep my face still. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. He does not speak," the Duke repeated, enunciating each word with careful precision. "He has not spoken a word since his mother died 3 years ago. The physicians say there is nothing physically wrong with him. They say it is a matter of will, of choice. I say it is a matter of discipline, of weakness that must be corrected. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. He is 7 years old, Your Grace? Yes, and he understands perfectly well what is said to him. He reads, he writes, when forced to. But he does not speak, and he will not, and I will not have it. Do you understand me, Miss Ashford? I will not have it. The Duke stood then, and I realized how tall he truly was, well over 6 feet, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, to obedience. He moved to the window, his back to me, his hands clasped behind him, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigidity of his spine. I have dismissed 4 governesses in 2 years, he said, his voice flat. One believed my son needed coddling, that gentle encouragement would somehow coax words from him. Another thought he required a physician from Vienna who specialized in disorders of the mind. The third attempted to teach him through play, as though he were an infant incapable of serious study. The fourth lasted 3 weeks before she fled in tears, claiming the house was too dark, the child too disturbed, the situation impossible. He turned to face me again, and the firelight caught his eyes, making them gleam like metal. I do not want your pity, Miss Ashford. I do not want your theories or your gentle methods or your female sensibilities. I want my son educated. I want him to behave as a boy of his station should behave. I want him to speak, to take his place in society, to become the man he must become. If you cannot accomplish that, you will be dismissed like the others. Am I clear? I met his gaze, though my heart was pounding. Yes, Your Grace. You are perfectly clear. Are you? He took a step toward me, and I had to force myself not to step back. Because I find that women often say they understand when in fact they do not. They bring sentiment where logic is required. They bring softness where strength is needed. My son does not need another mother, Miss Ashford. He needs a teacher. Can you be that? I can, I said, and I meant it, though I had no idea then what I was promising, what it would cost me. The Duke studied me for a long moment, and I felt as though he were looking not at my face, but into my very soul, weighing and measuring, and finding me barely adequate. Very well, he said finally. You will begin tomorrow morning at 9. Mrs. Brennan will show you to the schoolroom. You will report to me each Friday evening on his progress. If I find your methods unsatisfactory, if I see any sign that you are coddling him or making excuses for his behavior, you will leave immediately. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Grace. He turned away again, back to his desk, back to his papers, and I understood I was dismissed. I curtsied, though he was not looking, then turned and left the study, closing the doors softly behind me. I found my way back through the dark corridors alone, for Mrs. Brennan had not waited, and by the time I reached my room, my hands were shaking. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the cold fireplace, trying to calm my racing heart. I had met cruel men before, indifferent men who saw governesses as little more than servants, barely above the scullery maid in status. But there was something different about the Duke of Wexford. It was not cruelty exactly, though there was that. It was a kind of emptiness, a void where warmth should have been, as though something vital had been carved out of him, and nothing remained but duty and coldness, and an anger that had nowhere to go but inward. That night, I lay awake in my narrow bed, listening to the wind howl across the moor, rattling the window in its frame. I thought about the boy who did not speak, the child who had lost his mother and been left alone with a father made of stone. I thought about the 4 women who had tried and failed to reach him, who had fled or been dismissed, and I wondered what made me think I could succeed where they had not. But I had nowhere else to go. No family to return to, no home waiting for me. This position, however difficult, however cold, was all I had. I did not know then that the silence of Thomas Wexford would become the loudest thing in my life. I did not know that in trying to save him, I would lose everything I had left to lose. I did not know that the letter I would one day write would change both our lives forever. But I would learn. God help me, I would learn. I met Thomas Wexford the following morning in the schoolroom, and the moment I saw him, I understood why 4 governesses had failed. He sat at a small desk near the window, his back perfectly straight, his hands folded on the wooden surface before him. He did not turn when I entered. He did not acknowledge my presence in any way. He simply stared out the window at the gray morning, at the moor stretching endlessly toward a horizon lost in mist, and he might have been carved from the same stone as the house itself. Mrs. Brennan had escorted me to the east wing immediately after breakfast, which I had again taken in silence among servants who would not meet my eyes. The schoolroom was larger than I had expected, with tall windows that let in cold northern light, shelves lined with books that looked untouched, a globe that had not been turned in years, and maps on the walls showing empires and territories that seemed to have no connection to the small, silent boy who inhabited this space. "This is Master Thomas," Mrs. Brennan said, though of course I knew who he was. "The boy did not move. He will take his meals here during the day. You will supervise. If there are any problems, you will send for me immediately." She left without another word, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, and I was alone with the child who would not speak. I took a moment to study him. He was small for 7 years old, thin, with dark hair like his father's, and the same angular features that would one day be handsome, but were now simply delicate. His clothes were expensive, perfectly tailored, but somehow they seemed too large for him, as though he were shrinking inside them. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were shadows under his eyes that no child should have. But it was his stillness that struck me most. Children are never still. They fidget, they squirm, they find it almost painful to sit quietly. Thomas sat as though movement itself had been bred out of him. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "My name is Miss Ashford. I am your new governess." Nothing. Not a flicker of response. His eyes remained fixed on the window. "I know you have had many governesses before me," I continued, moving slowly across the room until I stood a few feet from his desk. "I know you may not wish for another, but I am here and I intend to teach you, and I hope that in time we might come to an understanding." Still nothing. His hands remained folded, his expression blank. It was like speaking to a statue. I had prepared for this, of course. I had spent the sleepless hours of the night thinking about how I might reach a child who had retreated so far inside himself that speech seemed impossible. I had decided I would not force him, not immediately. I would not demand what he could not give. Instead, I would offer him something else. I moved to the shelves and selected a book, one I had noticed the evening before when I had come to survey the room while the house slept. It was a volume of Greek myths, beautifully illustrated, the kind of book a child might love if anyone had ever bothered to share it with him. I sat in the chair opposite his desk and opened the book. "I thought we might begin with a story," I said. "Do you know the tale of Perseus and Medusa?" No response, but I thought perhaps that his eyes had shifted slightly, that he had heard me even if he would not show it. I began to read. I read slowly, with expression, bringing the story to life, as my father had once done for me when I was a child, and the world seemed full of magic. I read about the hero and the monster, about the quest and the danger, about the moment when Perseus held up the shield and saw Medusa's reflection and understood how he might defeat her without being turned to stone. As I read, I watched Thomas from the corner of my eye. He did not move, but something changed in the quality of his stillness. He was listening. I was certain of it. When I finished the first story, I closed the book and set it on his desk. "Tomorrow," I said, "we will read another. But today, I would like you to write something for me. Not about the story, if you do not wish to. Write about anything you like, or draw, if you prefer. I only ask that you try." I placed paper and a pencil before him, then moved away to give him space. I busied myself at the bookshelf, appearing to examine the volumes there, but in truth I was watching him reflected in the glass of a picture frame on the wall. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, slowly, he picked up the pencil. His hand hovered over the paper, trembling slightly, and I held my breath. Finally, he began to draw. I did not approach him. I did not hover or praise or ask to see what he was creating. I simply let him work. And when an hour had passed and a maid came with his lunch on a tray, I quietly collected the paper before he could hide it or destroy it. It was a drawing of a woman. She was beautiful, rendered with surprising skill for a child, with long hair and a kind face. She wore a dress that might have been fashionable a few years earlier, and she was standing in a garden, surrounded by roses. In the corner of the page, in careful letters, he had written a single word: Mama. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my face calm. "This is lovely, Thomas," I said quietly. "Thank you for sharing it with me." He did not look at me, but his shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, relaxed slightly. That afternoon, I introduced him to mathematics, working through simple problems on the slate board, speaking in a steady voice, asking questions I did not expect him to answer aloud, but writing them where he could read them, giving him chalk so he could respond if he chose. He did occasionally, writing numbers in a cramped, careful hand. By the time evening came and I returned to my cold little room, I was exhausted in a way I had never been before. Teaching a child who would not speak required a different kind of energy, a constant attention, a sensitivity to the smallest signs of response or withdrawal. But I had survived the first day, and I thought perhaps that I had made the smallest beginning. The days that followed established a pattern. Each morning, I arrived at the schoolroom at 9. Each morning, Thomas was already there, sitting in the same position, staring out the window. Each morning, I read him a story, then moved on to lessons. I taught him Latin and French, reading the words aloud and having him copy them. I taught him geography, pointing to places on maps and telling him stories about the people who lived there. I taught him literature and history, filling the silent room with words, with voices, with life. And slowly, very slowly, he began to respond. Not with speech, never with speech, but with other signs. He would bring me drawings he had made, slipping them onto my desk when he thought I was not looking. He would write answers to questions, his handwriting growing more confident. Once, when I was reading a particularly sad passage from a novel, I saw tears on his cheeks, though he made no sound. I began to understand the child he might have been before grief locked him in silence. He was intelligent, curious, sensitive in a way that made the world both beautiful and painful for him. He loved stories, especially ones with brave heroes and impossible quests. He loved mathematics because it was orderly, predictable, safe. He loved music and would sit for hours if I sang while I worked, old ballads my father had taught me. But there were also days when he retreated entirely, when nothing I did could reach him, when he sat frozen and unreachable. And on those days, I learned to simply be present, to not push, to let him know through silence that he was not alone. 3 weeks passed, and I had my first report to deliver to the Duke. I spent the afternoon preparing what I would say, how I would explain that while Thomas had not spoken, he was learning, responding, emerging slowly from the shell he had built around himself. That evening, I was summoned to the study. The Duke was standing by the fire when I entered, a glass of wine in his hand, and he turned to look at me with those cold gray eyes. "Well, Miss Ashford," he said, "what progress have you to report?" I took a breath. "Thomas is a gifted child, Your Grace. He reads far above his age, his mathematical ability is exceptional, and he has a remarkable memory. He has completed all the work I have assigned him. Has he spoken?" The question cut through my careful report like a knife. "No, Your Grace, he has not." The Duke's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, disappointment or anger or both. "Then you have failed," he said flatly. "I would not characterize it as failure, Your Grace. He is communicating through writing and drawing. He is engaged with his lessons. These are significant steps. I do not pay you for steps, Miss Ashford. I pay you to teach my son to behave as he should. A gentleman speaks. A gentleman does not hide behind paper and pencil like a frightened child. He is a frightened child, I said, and the words were out before I could stop them. Your Grace, he is 7 years old. He lost his mother. He is grieving. The silence that followed was terrible. The Duke set down his glass with careful precision, and when he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. You presume to lecture me about my own son, Miss Ashford? I presume to tell you what I observe, Your Grace. Thomas is not defiant. He is not being difficult for the sake of difficulty. He is wounded, and wounds take time to heal. Time, the Duke repeated, and there was something almost like mockery in his tone. 4 governesses and 3 years, Miss Ashford. How much time does healing require? I do not know, Your Grace, but I know that forcing him to speak before he is ready will only drive him deeper into silence. He needs patience. He needs compassion. The Duke moved closer to me, and I saw the anger in his face now, barely controlled. What he needs, he said, each word precise and cutting, is discipline. What he needs is to understand that silence is not acceptable, that weakness will not be indulged. My father would have beaten it out of me. Perhaps I have been too gentle. Horror must have shown on my face because he smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Do not concern yourself, Miss Ashford. I am not a brute. But neither am I a fool. You have 1 more month. If Thomas is not speaking by then, you will be dismissed. Do you understand? Yes, Your Grace, I said, though my voice was barely audible. Good. You may go. I curtsied and fled, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I returned to my room and sat in the darkness, too overwrought even to light a candle. 1 month, 4 weeks. And then I would be cast out again, sent away with no reference, no prospects, nothing. But worse than my own fate was the knowledge of what it meant for Thomas. If I failed, another governess would come, one who might not be patient, who might employ the discipline his father advocated. Or no governess would come, and Thomas would be left alone in this cold house with a father who saw his silence as weakness, as willful disobedience rather than the cry of a wounded soul. I could not let that happen. I would not. The next morning, I arrived at the schoolroom with a new determination. Thomas was in his usual place, staring out at the moor, and I sat down across from him and looked at him until finally he turned his eyes to meet mine. Thomas, I said quietly, I need to tell you something. Your father is not pleased with your progress. He wants you to speak, and he has given me 1 month to help you find your voice. If I cannot, I will be sent away. His eyes widened slightly, the first strong emotion I had seen him display. I reached across the desk and laid my hand gently over his, and he did not pull away. I do not tell you this to frighten you, I said. I tell you because I want you to understand something. I will not force you to speak. I will not punish you or make you feel ashamed of your silence. But I want you to know that I believe you can speak when you are ready. I believe there are words inside you, waiting for the moment when it feels safe to let them out. He stared at me, and I saw tears gathering in his eyes. I squeezed his hand gently. Until then, I said, I will be here. I will read to you and teach you and listen to everything you cannot say aloud. And whatever happens, I want you to know that you are not alone. Do you understand? Slowly, he nodded. Then, with his free hand, he reached for the pencil and paper. He wrote 3 words, his handwriting shaky. Please do not leave. I felt my own tears threaten, but I blinked them back. I will not leave you by choice, I promised. I will fight to stay. But Thomas, you must help me. You must try. He looked at me for a long moment, then wrote again. I am afraid. I know, I whispered. I know you are, but I am here. and I will keep you safe as long as I am able." He withdrew his hand then and turned back to the window, but something had shifted between us. We had reached each other across the silence, and for the first time since I had arrived at Wexford Hall, I felt a small flicker of hope. The days that followed were different. Thomas began to stay closer to me during lessons, to watch my face as I read, to write longer responses to my questions. He drew more pictures, and I began to understand that they were his way of telling stories, of expressing things too painful for words. He drew his mother often, always in the garden, always smiling. He drew the house as it must have been when she was alive, with flowers in the windows and light streaming through doors. He never drew his father. I also began to take him outside, despite the cold, despite Mrs. Brennan's disapproval. We walked in the overgrown garden, and I told him the names of plants, of birds, of clouds. We collected stones and leaves, and I watched as he examined each one with careful attention, as though trying to memorize every detail. One afternoon, 3 weeks into my tenure, we were sitting on a stone bench in the garden, when Thomas suddenly stood and walked to a rose bush, bare and thorny in the winter cold. He stood there for a long time, and when he turned back to me, his face was wet with tears. I went to him and knelt down so we were eye to eye. "What is it, Thomas?" I asked gently. He pointed to the rosebush, then to the ground where a few dried petals still lay scattered. Then he opened his mouth, and I saw him struggle, saw the effort it cost him, the way his whole body tensed with the attempt. No sound came. He closed his mouth, and the tears came harder. I pulled him into my arms, and for the first time, he did not resist. He clung to me and wept, and I held him and rocked him gently. There in the cold garden, and I whispered that it was all right, that he had tried, that I was proud of him for trying. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were red, but there was something new in his face. Not defeat, but a kind of recognition. He knew I would not abandon him for his failure. He knew I meant what I had said. That night, I wrote in my journal, the small leather-bound book I had kept since my father's death, where I recorded my thoughts and observations. I wrote about Thomas, about his attempt to speak, about the courage it had taken. I wrote about my fear that I would fail him, that I would be dismissed and he would be left alone. And I wrote something else, something I had not allowed myself to acknowledge until that moment. I wrote that I had come to love this silent, wounded child, and that I would do anything to protect him. I did not know then that I would have to prove those words or what the cost would be. But as I sat in my cold room, writing by candlelight, I felt the weight of the promise I had made, and I knew I would keep it, no matter what came. The month the Duke had given me was nearly gone when everything changed. It happened on a grey afternoon in December, when the wind howled across the moor with a fury that rattled the windows and sent servants scurrying to light fires in rooms that had been dark and cold for years. The Duke was hosting guests, a rare occurrence at Wexford Hall, and the house had been transformed. Fires burned in every hearth, candles blazed in silver holders, and the great rooms that had stood empty were suddenly filled with voices and laughter and the rustle of silk. I had been instructed to keep Thomas in the schoolroom, away from the guests, as though his silence were something shameful that must be hidden. But Thomas had grown restless as the day wore on, distracted by the sounds drifting up from below, and finally, I made a decision that would alter both our lives. "We will go down," I told him, "just for a moment. I want you to see that the world is not always cold and dark. I want you to remember what your home was like when your mother lived." He looked at me with wide eyes, uncertain, but when I held out my hand, he took it. Together, we descended the stairs, keeping to the shadows, and found a place on the landing where we could look down into the entrance hall below. The guests were arriving for dinner, men in evening dress and women in gowns of every color, their jewels catching the candlelight. They were laughing, talking, alive in a way that seemed impossible in this house. I watched Thomas's face as he observed them, and I saw something I had not seen before. Longing. He remembered this, I realized. He remembered when Wexford Hall had been like this, when his mother had presided over gatherings, when there had been warmth and light and joy. Among the guests, I noticed a woman who stood apart from the others. She was perhaps 30, beautiful in a calculated way, with golden hair and a dress cut lower than propriety strictly allowed. She stood close to the Duke, her hand on his arm, her head tilted toward him in a gesture of intimacy that made my stomach tighten with something I did not want to name. "That is Lady Constance Hartley," a voice said behind me, and I turned to find Mrs. Brennan standing in the shadows. She comes from London often these days. There is talk. I did not ask what kind of talk. I did not need to. The way Lady Constance looked at the Duke, the way she touched him, spoke clearly enough. She was not simply a guest. She was a woman with intentions, a woman who saw the Duke of Wexford as a prize to be won. Mrs. Brennan's eyes shifted to Thomas, and her expression hardened. "The boy should not be here," she said. "The Duke will not approve." "I was just taking him back to the schoolroom," I replied, keeping my voice steady. But before I could move, Lady Constance's voice rang out from below, clear and carrying. "Your Grace," she called, and I saw the Duke turn toward her. "I insist you give me a tour of the house. I am told it is magnificent, though one would never know it from the darkness you keep it in." There was laughter from the other guests, and the Duke, to my astonishment, smiled. It was a terrible smile, cold and practiced, but it was the first I had seen on his face. "Of course, Lady Constance," he said. "Though I warn you, much of Wexford Hall is closed up. There has been no need for grandeur." "Then it is time to open it again," she said, and her meaning was clear to everyone. She meant to be the next Duchess of Wexford, to bring light and life back to these halls, to replace the woman who still haunted every corner. The Duke began to lead her and several other guests through the rooms on the ground floor, and I should have taken Thomas and fled back to the schoolroom. But I did not. I stayed, watching, and Thomas stayed with me, his small hand tight in mine. They moved through the drawing room, the library, the music room, where a pianoforte stood covered in dust. Lady Constance exclaimed over everything, her voice too bright, too eager, and I saw the other guests exchange glances, some amused, some uncomfortable. The Duke answered her questions with polite detachment, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when she laughed too loudly. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. "And your son, Your Grace? Where is the young heir to Wexford? I am most eager to meet him." The Duke's expression went blank. "He is occupied with his studies," he said. "Another time, perhaps." But Lady Constance was not to be put off. "Surely he can spare a moment," she insisted. "I have brought him a gift from London, a toy soldier, finely made. Every boy loves soldiers, do they not?" There was a silence, and I saw several guests shift uncomfortably. They knew, I realized. The gossip had spread, even to London. They knew about the boy who would not speak, and they had come partly to see for themselves, to witness the Duke's shame. "Very well," the Duke said finally, and his voice was like ice. "Mrs. Brennan, fetch Thomas." I felt Thomas's hand clench in mine, felt him begin to tremble. I should have taken him away then. I should have refused. But Mrs. Brennan was already climbing the stairs, her eyes fixed on us with something like triumph, and I knew we were trapped. "Come," she said to Thomas. "Your father has called for you." Thomas shook his head violently, pressing himself against my side. Mrs. Brennan reached for him, but I stepped between them. "He is frightened," I said. "Please, let me bring him down. Let me stay with him." "That is not your decision to make," Mrs. Brennan said. But before she could say more, the Duke's voice cut through the hall below. "Miss Ashford, bring my son here. Now." I had no choice. I took Thomas's hand and led him down the stairs, feeling every eye upon us. The guests had fallen silent. watching with the kind of avid curiosity people show at accidents, at tragedies. Thomas's whole body was rigid with fear, but he walked beside me, trusting me even as I led him into what I knew would be an ordeal. We reached the bottom of the stairs, and the Duke looked at his son with an expression I could not read. "Thomas," he said, "greet our guests." Thomas said nothing. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the floor, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I felt my heart breaking for him. Lady Constance swept forward, her skirts rustling, and knelt down with a practiced smile. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "I have brought you something. Look." She held out a wooden soldier, beautifully painted, but Thomas did not reach for it. He did not even look at it. He simply stood there, trembling, and I could feel the tension building in the room like a storm about to break. "Thomas," the Duke said, and there was a warning in his voice. "Take the gift. Thank Lady Constance." Nothing. The silence stretched out, unbearable, and I saw embarrassment flash across Lady Constance's face, then annoyance. She stood, the smile gone. "How peculiar," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Is he simple?" "He is not simple," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. "He is grieving." Lady Constance turned to look at me as though noticing me for the first time. "And who are you?" "Miss Ashford is Thomas's governess," the Duke said, and there was ice in his voice now, directed at me, "and she has apparently forgotten her place." I felt blood rush to my cheeks, but I could not stop myself. "With respect, Your Grace, Thomas is not ready for this. He needs time." "Time," the Duke repeated, and I heard all his frustration, all his anger, focused into that single word. "He has had 3 years, Miss Ashford. He has had 4 governesses and countless physicians and more patience than any child deserves. What he needs is discipline." He looked down at Thomas, and I saw something terrible in his face. "Thomas," he said, "you will speak. You will greet our guests properly. You will say thank you to Lady Constance. You will do it now, or you will be punished." Thomas began to cry, silent tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking. I moved closer to him instinctively, wanting to shield him, but the Duke's voice stopped me. "Step away from him, Miss Ashford." "Your Grace, please," I began, but he cut me off. I said step away. I could not. I put my hand on Thomas's shoulder, and I looked at the Duke, and I saw the moment his control snapped. In 3 strides, he crossed the space between us and gripped Thomas's arm, pulling him roughly away from me. "You will speak," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You will stop this weakness, this defiance. You will behave as my son should behave." Thomas's mouth opened, and I saw him try, saw the desperate effort, but no sound came. His face twisted with anguish, and still the Duke held him, and the guests watched in horrified silence. I could not bear it. I stepped forward and put myself between them. "Let him go," I said. "Please, Your Grace, you are hurting him." The Duke released Thomas so suddenly the boy stumbled, and then his eyes fixed on me with a fury that made me step back. "You dare," he said softly. "You dare to interfere between me and my son. I am trying to protect him," I said, and my voice was shaking now. "Can you not see what you are doing to him? He is a child. He is your child. He is my son," the Duke said, and every word was a lash. "And you are dismissed. Collect your things and leave this house tonight. You will have no reference. You will never work as a governess again. Do you understand me? You are finished." The room spun. I heard Lady Constance's satisfied laugh, heard the murmur of the guests, heard Mrs. Brennan's sharp intake of breath. But all I could see was Thomas, crumpled on the floor where he had fallen, his face buried in his hands, sobbing without sound. I knelt beside him and gathered him into my arms, and I did not care who was watching. I held him and whispered that it would be all right, even though I knew it would not be, even though I knew I was lying. The Duke turned away. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his voice flat and cold. "See that Miss Ashford is gone within the hour. Thomas will be taken to his room. The dinner will proceed as planned." He walked away back toward the drawing room, and the guests followed, eager to escape the scene they had witnessed. Lady Constance lingered, looking at me with contempt, then followed the Duke, her hand possessive on his arm. Mrs. Brennan pulled Thomas from my arms with surprising strength. "Come, Master Thomas," she said. "You have made enough spectacle for one evening." Thomas reached for me, his eyes desperate, and I tried to hold on to him, but Mrs. Brennan was already carrying him away, and 2 footmen had appeared to escort me to my room. I was allowed to pack my small trunk under their watchful eyes. I was given no time to say goodbye, no chance to explain to Thomas what had happened. Within the hour, as the Duke had commanded, I was in a carriage heading away from Wexford Hall, away from the child I had come to love, into a darkness I could not see beyond. The journey back to the village where the coaching inn stood was a blur. I sat in the cold carriage with my trunk at my feet and my heart in pieces. And I thought about Thomas's face, about the terror in his eyes, about how alone he must feel now. At the inn, I took a room with the last of my money and sat on the narrow bed, staring at nothing. I had failed him. I had promised to protect him, and I had failed. And now he was alone with a father who saw his silence as weakness, with servants who did not understand, with no one to stand between him and the cold judgment of the world. I could not sleep. I paced the small room as the hours passed, and finally, in the darkest part of the night, I lit a candle and sat at the small desk. I took out paper and my pen, and I began to write. I wrote a letter to Thomas, though I did not know if he would ever receive it. I wrote everything I had not been able to say, everything I wanted him to know. I told him that he was brave, that his silence was not weakness, but a kind of strength, a protection his heart had built to keep itself safe. I told him that one day he would speak again, when he was ready, when the world felt safe enough. I told him that his mother would have been proud of him, that she was watching over him, that he was not alone even when it felt that way. I told him that I loved him, and that nothing that had happened was his fault. I told him to be patient with himself, to be kind to the wounded places inside him, to remember that healing takes time. I told him that even though I could not be with him, he would always be in my heart, and that somewhere, somehow, I would be thinking of him and hoping for his happiness. When I finished, my hand was cramped and the candle had burned low. I folded the letter carefully and sealed it with wax, and I wrote his name on the outside in my clearest hand. The next morning, I found a boy in the village who was willing to carry a message for a few coins. I gave him the letter and all the money I had left, and I told him to take it to Wexford Hall, to find a way to get it to Master Thomas, to make sure no one else read it first. The boy looked at me strangely, but he took the money and the letter and disappeared down the road. I watched him go, and I prayed that somehow, against all odds, Thomas would receive the words I had written, and that they would give him some small comfort in the lonely days ahead. Then I turned away from Wexford Hall, away from the moor and the grey house and the child I could not save, and I began to walk toward a future I could not imagine, in a world that had suddenly grown very cold and very dark and very empty. I did not know that the letter would reach Thomas 3 days later, slipped under his door by a young scullery maid who had seen me with him in the garden and knew we had cared for each other. I did not know that he would read it over and over, that he would sleep with it under his pillow, that the words would become a lifeline for him in the weeks that followed, and I did not know that the Duke would discover the letter, would read every word, and would finally understand what he had done. I found work in a textile mill in Manchester, the only employment available to a woman with no references and no connections. The work was brutal, the hours long, the pay barely enough to rent a corner of a room in a boarding house where 6 of us slept in shifts. My hands, which had once held books and pens, became rough and bleeding from the machines. My lungs burned from the cotton dust that filled the air. But I was alive, and I told myself that was enough. It was not enough. Every night I lay awake in the darkness, listening to the breathing of strangers, and I thought about Thomas. I wondered if he had received my letter, if it had brought him any comfort, or if it had been intercepted and destroyed. I wondered if he was speaking now, if another governess had succeeded where I had failed. I wondered if he remembered me at all, or if I had become just another shadow in his life, another person who had left him. 3 months passed in this way, each day blending into the next in a gray monotony of work and exhaustion. I grew thinner, quieter, harder. The other women in the mill left me alone, sensing perhaps that I was different, that I carried something they could not understand. I made no friends. I wanted none. I existed, nothing more. Then one evening in March, when the first hints of spring were beginning to soften the harsh winter air, everything changed again. I returned to the boarding house after my shift to find the landlady waiting for me, her face pinched with disapproval. "There is a gentleman asking for you," she said, as though the very idea were scandalous. I told him you were not the sort to receive male visitors, but he insisted. "He is waiting in the parlor." My heart began to pound. A gentleman. I could think of only one reason a gentleman would seek me out, and the thought filled me with dread. Something had happened to Thomas. He was ill or hurt or worse. I rushed to the parlor, my mind racing, and stopped short when I saw who stood there. It was not the Duke of Wexford. It was a man I had never seen before, perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, but not ostentatious, with kind eyes and a thoughtful face. He turned when I entered, and I saw relief cross his features. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Thank God. I was beginning to fear I would never find you." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "What do you want?" "My name is Dr. William Hartwell," he said. "I am a physician from London. I have been engaged by the Duke of Wexford to locate you on behalf of his son." The room seemed to tilt. "Thomas," I whispered. "Is he all right?" "He is alive," Dr. Hartwell said carefully. "But he is not well, Miss Ashford. That is why I am here." He gestured to the shabby sofa, and we sat, though I could barely keep still. Dr. Hartwell drew a breath and began to speak, and with every word, my heart broke a little more. "After you were dismissed," he said, "Thomas withdrew completely. He stopped eating. He stopped attending lessons. He would not leave his room. The Duke, I am told, tried everything. He engaged new governesses, but Thomas would not see them. He brought in physicians, but Thomas would not cooperate. He grew thinner, weaker, and still he would not speak, would not engage, would barely acknowledge the world around him. I felt tears burning in my eyes. "I should never have left," I said. "I should have fought harder to stay." "You were dismissed," Dr. Hartwell said gently. "You had no choice. But Miss Ashford, there is something you must know. 3 weeks ago, the Duke found a letter. It was hidden beneath Thomas's pillow. A letter you had written to the boy." My breath caught. "He read it?" "He read it," Dr. Hartwell confirmed, "and I am told it affected him profoundly. He came to London immediately to engage my services. He asked me to find you, to bring you back to Wexford Hall if you were willing. He said that Thomas needs you, and that he was wrong to dismiss you as he did." I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. "The Duke said that. Those were his words. He also said that he would offer you whatever salary you named, that he would give you complete authority over Thomas's care and education, and that he would not interfere with your methods. He said," Dr. Hartwell continued, his voice careful, "that he had been a fool, and that he had nearly destroyed his son through his own pride and blindness." I could not speak. I sat there, trembling, as Dr. Hartwell reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "He asked me to give you this," he said. "He said you deserved an explanation, and that he owed you more than he could ever repay." I took the envelope with shaking hands, It was heavy paper, sealed with the Wexford crest. I broke the seal and unfolded the letter, and I began to read. The Duke's handwriting was strong and clear, but there was something in the way the letters formed that spoke of emotion barely controlled. He began with an apology, formal at first, acknowledging that he had treated me unjustly, that he had allowed his anger and pride to blind him to what Thomas needed. But as the letter went on, the formality fell away, and I saw the man beneath the title. The father beneath the Duke. He wrote about finding my letter to Thomas, about reading the words I had written to his son. He wrote that he had realized, with a horror he could barely describe, that I had understood Thomas in a way he never had, that I had seen the child's pain and met it with compassion while he had met it with demands and frustration. He wrote that he had spent 3 years trying to force his son to be someone he was not ready to be, trying to make him strong by denying him the very comfort and understanding he needed most. He wrote about his late wife, Thomas's mother. Her name had been Catherine, and she had been gentle and kind, everything he was not. She had filled Wexford Hall with light and laughter, and when she died giving birth to a daughter who lived only hours, something in him had died as well. He had retreated into coldness, into duty, unable to bear the pain of loss. He had looked at his son and seen only his own failure, his inability to protect the people he loved, and he had hardened his heart rather than let himself feel that vulnerability again. But reading my letter had broken something open in him. He wrote that he had wept for the first time since Catherine's death, wept for his son, for his wife, for all the years he had wasted in coldness and pride. He wrote that he did not deserve forgiveness, but that he was begging for a chance to make things right, not for himself, but for Thomas. The letter ended with a simple plea. "Come back," he wrote. "Thomas needs you. I need you. Please, Miss Ashford, give us another chance." I folded the letter carefully, my hands trembling, my vision blurred with tears. Dr. Hartwell sat quietly, waiting, and when I looked up at him, I saw that he understood. "Will you come?" he asked gently. I thought about Thomas, about his small hand in mine, about the trust in his eyes when he looked at me. I thought about the drawing he had made of his mother, about the words he had written. "Please do not leave." I thought about the Duke, about the man revealed in his letter, broken and grieving and finally willing to change. "Yes," I said, "I will come." The journey back to Wexford Hall took 2 days. Dr. Hartwell accompanied me, and during the long hours in the carriage, he told me more about what had happened in my absence. He told me that the Duke had dismissed Lady Constance Hartley permanently, that he had closed Wexford Hall to all visitors, that he had spent hours sitting outside Thomas's room, trying to reach his son through the closed door. He told me that Thomas had stopped eating almost entirely, that he had grown dangerously thin, that there was real concern for his life. By the time we arrived at Wexford Hall, my anxiety had grown to near panic. The house looked different somehow, though I could not say exactly how. Perhaps it was the light, for it was afternoon and the sun was breaking through clouds, casting golden beams across the gray stone. Or perhaps it was simply that I was seeing it with different eyes, knowing what I now knew about the man who lived within. The Duke met us at the door himself. He looked changed, older somehow, thinner, with shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. He stood there, this powerful man, this Duke, and he looked at me with something I had never seen in his face before. Humility. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice was rough. "Thank you for coming. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I am grateful beyond words that you are here." I did not know what to say, so I simply nodded. Dr. Hartwell excused himself, saying he would examine Thomas, and suddenly I was alone with the Duke in the entrance hall, where he had dismissed me 3 months before. "I owe you an apology," he said. "More than an apology. I owe you my son's life, perhaps. For without your letter, I do not think I would have understood what I was doing to him, what I had already done. "Your Grace," I began, but he held up a hand. "Please," he said, "let me say this. I was wrong. About everything. About Thomas, about his silence, about what he needed. I thought strength meant hardness, that love meant discipline, that showing emotion was weakness. My father raised me to believe those things, and I never questioned them. But you showed me something different. You showed me that real strength is gentleness, that real love is understanding, and that the bravest thing any of us can do is allow ourselves to feel." He took a breath, and I saw the effort it cost him to continue. "I have spent 3 years angry at my son for grieving, for being wounded, when all along I was the wounded one. I was the one who could not face my own pain, so I denied his. I was the one who was weak, not him." "Where is Thomas now?" I asked quietly. "In his room. He will not come out. He will not eat. He barely sleeps. The physician says if this continues much longer, we will lose him." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice broke. "I cannot lose him, Miss Ashford. He is all I have left of her. He is all I have left of myself, of the man I was before grief made me into something cold and cruel." "Take me to him," I said. The Duke led me up the stairs through corridors I remembered, to a door I had stood outside many times. He knocked softly. "Thomas," he said, "someone is here to see you. Someone who has come a very long way to be with you." There was no response. The Duke looked at me, and I saw fear in his eyes, naked and terrible. I reached for the door handle and turned it slowly. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Then I saw him. Thomas was huddled in the corner of the room, wrapped in a blanket, his face turned to the wall. He was so thin that my breath caught. His hair was long and unkempt, and his small shoulders were hunched as though trying to make himself disappear. I crossed the room and knelt beside him, and I put my hand gently on his shoulder. "Thomas," I said softly, "it is Miss Ashford. I have come back." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His eyes met mine, and I saw the shock, the disbelief, the desperate hope. His mouth opened, and I waited, my heart pounding, and then I heard it. A sound, small, broken, barely audible, but a sound. His voice, after 3 years of silence. "You came back," he whispered, and the words were like a miracle. I pulled him into my arms, and he clung to me with what little strength he had, and I felt his tears soaking into my dress, felt his small body shaking with sobs that now, finally, had sound. I held him and rocked him and whispered that I was here, that I would not leave him again, that everything would be all right. Behind me, I heard a sound, and I turned to see the Duke standing in the doorway. He was staring at his son, at the boy who was finally speaking, and tears were streaming down his face. He sank to his knees, and I saw 3 years of grief and guilt and love pour out of him, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked human, vulnerable, real. "Thomas," he said, his voice breaking. "My son, I am so sorry. I am so very sorry." Thomas looked up from my arms, looked at his father, and something passed between them. Something wordless and profound. Then Thomas reached out his hand, and the Duke took it, and they held on to each other across the space that had divided them for so long, and I knew that healing, true healing, had finally begun. The days that followed Thomas's first words were like watching a flower slowly open after a long winter. He did not speak often at first, and when he did, his voice was soft, hesitant, as though he feared the words might shatter if spoken too loudly. But each day brought a little more, a few more sentences, a little more confidence, and with each word, I saw life returning to him. The Duke was transformed. He dismissed the cold formality that had ruled Wexford Hall and threw himself into learning how to be a father. He joined us in the schoolroom, sitting quietly in the corner, watching as I taught Thomas, and I could see him memorizing everything, trying to understand what his son needed. He began taking meals with Thomas, and though the conversations were awkward at first, stilted and uncertain, they gradually found a rhythm. One evening, perhaps 2 weeks after my return, the Duke came to the schoolroom as I was preparing to leave for the night. Thomas had already gone to bed, exhausted but happy after a day spent exploring the gardens that were slowly being restored. The Duke stood in the doorway, and I saw that he held something in his hands. "Miss Ashford," he said, "may I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course, Your Grace," I replied, setting down the book I had been organizing. He entered the room and closed the door behind him, and I felt suddenly aware of how alone we were, how the evening light through the windows cast shadows across his face. He looked different now, softer somehow, though the aristocratic bearing remained. He was still the Duke of Wexford, but he was also simply a man, wounded and healing, trying to find his way. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "Not just for returning, though God knows I will never be able to repay that debt, but for what you have done for Thomas these past weeks, for what you did before, when I was too blind to see it." "You are welcome, Your Grace," I said quietly. "Thomas is an extraordinary child. It is a privilege to teach him." "He is extraordinary because you helped him remember who he was," the Duke said. "You gave him back to himself, and in doing so, you gave him back to me." He stepped closer, and I felt my breath catch. He held out what he had been carrying, and I saw it was my letter to Thomas, the one I had written that desperate night at the inn. It was worn now, creased from being read and reread, and I could see that it had been folded and unfolded many times. "I should not have read this," he said. "It was not meant for me. But I am grateful I did, because it showed me what love looks like. Real love, not the cold shadow of it I had been offering my son. You wrote that healing takes time, that wounds must be treated with gentleness and patience. You were not writing only about Thomas. Were you, Miss Ashford?" I met his eyes, and I saw understanding there, and something else, something that made my heart beat faster. "No, Your Grace," I said. "I was writing about anyone who has been hurt, anyone who has lost someone they loved." "Anyone like me," he said softly. The air between us felt charged, alive, and I did not know what to say. The Duke folded the letter carefully and set it on the desk, then turned back to me, and I saw that his hands were trembling slightly. "I have something I need to ask you," he said. "Something I have no right to ask, but I find I cannot remain silent any longer. These past weeks, watching you with Thomas, watching you bring light back into this dark house, I have realized something that terrifies me. I have realized that you have not only saved my son, you have saved me as well." "Your Grace," I whispered, but he shook his head. "Please," he said, "let me finish, before my courage fails. When Catherine died, I thought I had died with her. I thought I would never feel anything again, never want anything again. I told myself it was better that way, safer, that if I felt nothing, I could not be hurt. But you have shown me that a life without feeling is not life at all. It is merely existence, cold and empty and meaningless." He took a breath, and I saw him gather himself, saw the courage it took for this proud man to make himself vulnerable. "Eleanor," he said, using my Christian name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips made something inside me tremble. "I do not know how to say this elegantly, so I will say it plainly. I have come to care for you deeply. More than care. I have come to love you, though I have no right to, though you have every reason to refuse me." I stood frozen, unable to believe what I was hearing. The Duke of Wexford, this man who had once been made of ice, was standing before me with his heart in his hands, offering it to me with a humility I had never imagined possible. "I know I am asking too much," he continued, his words tumbling out now. "I know that I treated you abominably, that I dismissed you with cruelty, that I have given you no reason to trust me. But Eleanor, I swear to you, I am not the man I was. You have changed me. Thomas has changed me. And if you could find it in your heart to give me a chance, I would spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you." I realized I was crying, tears streaming down my face, and I could not speak. The Duke saw my tears and stepped back, his face falling. "I understand," he said quietly. "I have asked too much. Please forgive me. I will not speak of this again." "No," I said, finding my voice at last. "No, you misunderstand. I am crying because I never imagined this could happen. I never imagined that you could see me as anything more than a servant, a governess hired to perform a task. You have never been merely a governess to me," he said fiercely. "Perhaps at first, yes. I was too much a fool to see what was before me. But Eleanor, you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. You have courage and compassion and a strength that puts my own to shame. When I think of what you endured, how you survived after I cast you out, how you still found the grace to return when I asked, I am humbled beyond measure." He moved closer again, and this time I did not step back. "I have nothing to offer you but a dark house on a desolate moor, a damaged man and a wounded child," he said. "But if you would accept those things, if you would accept us, I swear I would cherish you every day for the rest of our lives. I would give you anything in my power to give. And I would never, never take your presence for granted again." I looked at him, at this man who had been so cold, so cruel, and who had broken himself open to become something new, something real. I thought about Thomas, about the love I already felt for him, about how much he needed us both. I thought about Wexford Hall, about how it could be transformed from a mausoleum into a home. And I thought about my own heart, which had somehow, impossibly, begun to love this difficult, complicated man. "Yes," I whispered, "yes, I will accept you, all of you." The joy that flooded his face was like sunrise breaking over the moor. "Eleanor," he breathed. And then he was pulling me into his arms, holding me with a fierce tenderness that made me feel safe and cherished and home. We stood there in the schoolroom, wrapped in each other, and I felt the last of the ice around both our hearts finally melt away. When we told Thomas the next morning, he stared at us with wide eyes, processing what it meant. "You are going to marry Papa?" he asked, his voice still soft but growing stronger every day. "If you approve," I said, kneeling down so I could look into his eyes. "I would never do anything that would make you unhappy, Thomas. You must tell me truly. Is this all right with you?" He looked from me to his father, and then a smile broke across his face, the first real smile I had seen from him. "Will you be my new mama?" he asked. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "I could never replace your mama," I said gently. "She will always be your mama, and she will always love you. But if you would like, I could be something else. I could be someone who loves you and takes care of you and is here for you always." "I would like that very much," Thomas said. And then he threw his arms around my neck, and I held him close, feeling the Duke's hand rest gently on my shoulder, and I knew that we were no longer three separate people, but a family, imperfect and healing, but bound together by love. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. The Duke courted me properly, despite the fact that we lived in the same house, bringing me flowers from the gardens that were blooming again, reading poetry to me in the evenings, taking walks with me across the moor. He asked my opinions on everything, treating me not as a subordinate, but as an equal, and I watched him learn how to laugh again, how to be playful, how to let joy into his life. Thomas flourished. He spoke more each day, his voice growing confident, his personality emerging like a butterfly from a chrysalis. He was clever and funny and kind, and I watched the Duke discover his son properly for the first time, marvel at him, delight in him. They began spending hours together, riding across the estate, working in the gardens, reading in the library, and I would watch them sometimes and feel overwhelmed with gratitude for the miracle of second chances. We were married in the small church near Wexford Hall on a morning in June when the moor was covered in wildflowers. Thomas stood beside his father as I walked down the aisle, and when I reached them, Thomas took my hand and placed it in his father's hand, and the three of us smiled at each other through tears of joy. The Duke spoke his vows in a voice that shook with emotion, promising to love and cherish me, to honor and protect me, for all the days of our lives. I spoke mine just as fervently, promising to stand beside him, to share his burdens, to help him be the man and father he wanted to be. When the ceremony ended and we walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, I looked back at the church and saw the portrait of Catherine, Thomas's mother, in a place of honor near the altar. The Duke had placed it there himself, wanting her to be present, wanting her to know that we had not forgotten her, that we would never forget her. I think she would have approved, he had said when he showed me. I think she would have wanted Thomas to be happy, to have someone to love him. I think so too, I had replied, and I meant it. There was room in our hearts for the memory of Catherine, for the love she had given, and the love she would have wanted for her son. Our love did not erase hers. It honored it. We held a small wedding breakfast at Wexford Hall, and as I stood in the entrance hall that had once felt so cold and forbidding, I marveled at how different it looked now. Flowers filled every corner, light streamed through windows that had been cleaned and opened, and laughter echoed through rooms that had stood silent for too long. Mrs. Brennan had even smiled at me that morning, a small, grudging smile, but a smile nonetheless. That evening, after the guests had gone and Thomas had been tucked into bed, the Duke and I stood together in the doorway of the schoolroom, looking at the space where everything had changed. He put his arm around my waist and pulled me close, and I rested my head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked quietly. "The night I dismissed you?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not with anger anymore. If it had not happened, we might never have found our way to each other. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best ones." He turned me to face him, and I saw love in his eyes, and wonder, and a gratitude that mirrored my own. "I do not deserve you," he said. "I know that, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to." "You already do," I said. "Every day, you already do." He kissed me then, tender and reverent, and I tasted salt and knew we were both crying, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home after a long and painful journey. In the years that followed, Wexford Hall became what it was always meant to be: a home. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, articulate young man, secure in the knowledge that he was loved, able to speak not only with his voice but with his heart. He never forgot his mother, but he was not haunted by her loss anymore. He had learned, as we all had, that grief and joy could exist together, that remembering the past did not mean being trapped by it. The Duke and I had children of our own, 3 daughters who filled the house with noise and laughter and light. Thomas was a devoted older brother, patient and protective, and I would watch him with his sisters and marvel at the journey we had all taken, at how far we had come from those dark, silent days. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the moor stretched silver under the moon, the Duke would take the letter from his desk drawer, the letter I had written to Thomas so long ago, and he would read it again. It had become sacred to him, a reminder of what love truly was, of what we had almost lost and what we had miraculously found. And I would sit beside him, my hand in his, and I would remember the frightened young woman who had arrived at Wexford Hall with nothing but hope and determination. I would remember the cold Duke who had seemed beyond redemption. I would remember the silent child who had taught us all what courage really meant. We had all been broken in our own ways. We had all carried wounds we thought would never heal. But we had found each other, and in finding each other, we had discovered that healing was possible, that love could grow even in the darkest soil, that second chances were real and precious and worth fighting for. The feared Duke of Wexford had fired the governess in public, yes, But he had also read the letter she left his son, and that letter had changed everything. It had broken down walls built over years of grief and pride. It had shown him what his heart had forgotten, and it had led all of us, home. As I sat there in the quiet of that library, surrounded by books and memories and love, I thought about all the people who had walked through Wexford Hall over the centuries, all the stories these walls had witnessed, and I knew that ours would be remembered, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the power of compassion over coldness, of patience over pride, of love over all the forces that seek to divide and diminish us. We were a family now, imperfect, still healing in small ways, but bound together by something stronger than blood or duty or the expectations of society. We were bound by choice, by the decision we made every day to see each other truly, to speak honestly, to love bravely. And that, I had learned, was everything. The Duke turned to me and smiled, and I saw in his face the man he had become, the man he had always been capable of being. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" I asked, though I knew. "For not giving up on us," he said, "for seeing what we could be, even when we could not see it ourselves, for loving my son when I did not know how, for teaching me that strength and gentleness are not opposites, but partners, for everything, Eleanor, for absolutely everything." I leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, feeling the warmth of the fire and the peace of the moment. "We are all teaching each other," I said. "That is what families do." Outside, the wind moved across the moor, but it no longer sounded lonely or desolate. It sounded like freedom, like possibility, like the future opening before us bright and wide and full of promise. And as I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of wood smoke and old books and home, I knew that we had finally, truly, come through the darkness into the light.